Well, Professor Davies, again, welcome to my podcast. I have met you in so many occasions in formal and informal settings, but this is kind of new because we are having this Zoom-based podcast where I'm kind of connecting online, and it's not that a nice day, at least in Ireland, with a storm almost going to batter Ireland within a few hours, apparently. But we'll have kind of better arguments and better conversation over this, even if the storm is raging outside.
At least you're on the east side, not the west side
Of Ireland. Yes, absolutely. I think this climate change is visible, and it's absolute. But I think that will also come into our conversation because how climate change, and I know you are very interested in One Health.
Yes.
And this climate change ecosystem, how do we interact with our environment and how does it influence our healthcare, our welfare? That will all come on reflected onto our conversation at the later stages. But usually what I do, Professor Davies, in my podcast is I'm fortunate enough that different, speakers who has a lot of expertise, a lot of erudition in different projects, different domains. They come to my projects, they come to my podcast. I usually always start by inviting them, giving us a kind of a snapshot, a kind of a quick preview or a summary of their career. And you are kind of a thespian in this world of anatomy. So how did it all went on? How did you start? How did you become an anatomist?
It started, I guess, when I was doing towards the end of my PhD. I realized that I was very interested in research, predominantly in neuromorphology, and that if I wanted to pursue that, I would have to get a university position, and a university position in something that I could teach and have an interest in. So neuromorphology metamorphosed into all of morphology. And I decided that anatomy would be the subject I would try to make a career in.
Which year and which institute or university you were doing your PhD?
I was doing my PhD between 1974, 77 in the University of Cambridge.
Before I was born. And I believe the climate was very different then in Cambridge, isn't it?
It was indeed. We're not really getting so much global warming at the moment, but climate change, definitely. It's much wetter now than it used to be. And when I say it has not been getting a lot warmer, because summers were often could be very hot. I remember 1976. I spent a month in East Africa, and when I flew back to the UK was much browner than Kenya or Uganda. But the winters definitely were colder. There not much snow, but a little bit of snow and ice would lay on the ground for a considerable amount of time. I remember when I bought my first house, it was a wreck. And that first winter, when I was trying to fix things like leaking taps, well, I was having icicles coming out of the taps inside the house and ice on the inside of the windows. No double glazing in those days.
Okay, well, how was the PhD done then? For example, in the UK right now, you have the PhDs like 3 years, 4 years.
3 years.
And was it a stipulated kind of a time or fixed allotted time in your time?
Absolutely. My supervisor was really clear that there was no alternative other than to finish within the 3 years.
So 3 years.
Yeah. And so I think that's an important role of a supervisor because, as you know, research never finishes. Somebody's got to tell you that's enough.
So you had 3 years of PhD, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, if you have 3 years of PhD, how was the funding those days? Because funding is a huge issue these days, apparently. And how did funding go that time?
It was a government scholarship, the Science Research Council.
I'm trying to understand the trajectory. So you did your PhD and then you have to do postdocs or something? Or was it just straightway you could become a lecturer? Something?
No. I started doing a little bit of anatomy teaching during the end of my PhD. Looking back on it, I must have been absolutely dreadful. Just doing some supervisions. And at the end of the PhD, it was, if I didn't make a university career, what was I going to do? So I actually applied to do medicine, and I did undergraduate medicine. So at the end of that, I could say I had dissected the body.
Okay.
And what is absolutely astonishing now, the way things are going in interviews, I actually said in the interview that I did not want to treat patients. I wanted to be an anatomist.
I had a similarity there because
now I would, anybody who came to me for advice about that, I would tell them to lie.
Well, for me, it was kind of not similar, but I could understand that I wanted to become more into a theoretical fields and research-oriented fields. I was not very keen in getting into treating patients. I guessed I did not have the psyche and the mental setup to get into all this. And that is one of the reasons I got into research. And never did I even imagine in my wildest dreams that I will be back to medical profession as in education field and become an anatomist. So I guess somewhere like you, I am also an anatomist by accident. And probably we were looking for better jobs, isn't it?
Well, a career, something that you would last for many years. And in fact, even though I am retired from my chair, I am still learning.
You're still learning.
Yes.
And that's what I keep on telling to my students, that anatomy is an evergreen subject. And it changes, but it changes, takes billions of years. And for one life, it is not a problem at all to find a job. And
certainly not.
Certainly not. And if you learn the topic and have a good understanding, then probably you do it once in your life, and that is good enough. But is it that evergreen anymore? Or do you think things are being superimposed onto anatomy? And probably, I'm not trying to make any controversy out of it, but I'm just trying to understand from the perspective, if we look through anatomy from the lens of medical curriculum, does it still enjoy that kingship of being the sub-medical disciplines?
Certainly it doesn't. I think it is undervalued at the moment, but I understand why the time available is being reduced. If I look back on my days as an undergraduate, things like immunology were new subjects. Endocrinology wasn't widespread, let alone the introduction of the social sciences into preclinical medicine, even though they existed in clinical medicine. So, and molecular biology, I mean, and nobody could have envisaged where that would have taken us in the early 70s, which was the structure of DNA had been elucidated, but the applications, nobody could really foresee that kind of future.
So you think some other, the throne of anatomy, and anatomy has been dethroned by emergence of new subjects.
Yes.
Which have given us better medicines, and probably made a big impact at the later stages?
That's a difficult thing to say, because a basic understanding of anatomy for all practitioners to be safe and competent up to the beginning of their specialization, whatever that is not going to change. It's a bit like systems physiology. You are going to have to know your respiratory physiology, your cardiac physiology, your renal physiology. Those basics are not going to change for those early years. What you do with it, how you build on it afterwards, that's a different thing.
I believe even those things are being threatened with the emergence of AI bots, and people think even they can run the ECG as a graph and AI will tell them what will happen. And so probably new threats are emerging. If not, I should not call threats, but probably new opportunities are evolving, which might not do great for the future of the current.
You have to have a considerable amount of knowledge to interpret what AI is telling you. When students use Wikipedia or Google something, if they have no background knowledge, they can't tell whether it's rubbish or not. Now, of course, I use these things, but I have an understanding of that doesn't make sense from my background knowledge. And that is going to be the same with AI, I think.
So you think, if I understand well, that you think that the basic knowledge and the basic foundation cannot be built on AI.
I think not.
And at the end of the day, probably it is a doctor who will call the final decision, not an AI.
It is.
Let's hope that doesn't change.
Let's hope that doesn't change, and let's hope they're qualified to make that decision.
But that will need, and I mean, these days it's funny that you have AI tools to catch which student has used AI tools.
Yeah.
So, it's getting a little bit funny that you use AI to catch people using AI.
In an invigilated examination, then they will not have the opportunity to use those tools. In coursework, they will. So perhaps we will be going back to less coursework and more final examinations in an invigilated situation.
Yeah. Professor Davies, I know when I was fortunate enough to shadow you in Imperial College London in teaching demonstrating anatomy. Now, the classes were huge, too many students. We had to break them down in smaller pieces or smaller groups. And there were times allotted. It was quite stressful. I learned a lot, but it was really, really stressful, sometimes physically stressful at the same time. Was it like that in your times? Because did you have enough number of faculties and the classes were smaller? Was it less stressful physically to cope with it?
The classes were definitely smaller. There were many medical schools with 100 students, or just over. A big medical school would have been 150 students per year. Mm-hmm. There were more anatomy faculty with my
how many times more?
In my first lectureship, we had depending on the year, between 95 and 105 students per year and 6 academic members of staff.
Is it Imperial?
That was at St. Mary's.
St. Mary's.
Which latterly became part of Imperial College.
Imperial College. So you have 6 faculties and 100 students, roughly.
Yes. And more technical staff as well.
That seems much better than modern times, probably.
But in the dissecting room, the staff-student ratio was probably worse. Because students were expected to do more by themselves. So the number of demonstrators in a practical class was smaller, but the time available to the students was larger.
You mean the contact hours were higher?
Well, yes, but with the contact with less students in 100 with 100 people in the dissecting room, there may have only been 1 or 2 academics, but the actual session was longer.
The sessions were longer, so 4 hours, something like that.
Yes, students had half a day.
Half a day, and half a day. So okay, so that's some time, I would say.
Yeah. But having said that, it's probably a bit less than that, because the day would start off with a lecture
Mhm.
at 9 o'clock, and then until lunchtime, it would be in the dissecting room.
And did you face any problem those days regarding acquisition of cadavers? Was it a problem, or did it get better?
No better, no worse. The numbers needed were obviously less because there were less students.
Yeah, that's and you had. I'm pretty sure it was, of course, like nowadays that you have made smaller groups and groups used to dissect. I can understand
It was a full dissection. Everybody dissected. There were no prosected parts available
at all.
No, at all.
No. So everything needs to be dissected. And I'm pretty sure you had specimens, don't you?
Not that many in that particular medical school. There was pathology, but the emphasis was on dissecting and seeing it yourself. There was one prosection available, and that was, again, for me as a junior lecturer, it was a valuable learning experience. The member of staff in charge of a class was expected to dissect a specimen to the right standard before the class began, so that the students could inspect that as well as do their own dissection.
Okay, that's interesting.
But that body was not kept for longer than that year. The whole procedure started again in the following academic year.
This is interesting. And I mean, that shows that on behalf of demonstrators or staff, there has to be proper experience in dissecting. I mean, you just cannot go end up in a dissection hall and pick up your scalpel and start dissecting the specimens. That brings to me the point that, at least what I have seen, there is not kind of a formal training of getting or being an anatomist. I mean, now I know there are certain British and even I think Irish universities who are offering MSc in human anatomy, but I don't know whether they existed in 1970s and 80s.
No, they didn't exist.
So what was the process of learning? There has to be some kind of a mentor-mentee relationship between of this demonstrator. I mean, how could you just go? I mean, someone needs to guide you, isn't it? What was the system?
One, I had dissected the body in the first place, but almost certainly appallingly.
Appallingly, yeah.
So I did need a lot of mentoring. But I would say that without a doubt that there were 6 members of academic staff, of which I was the most junior, but all 5 of the others taught me something.
So you as a one junior got 5 janitors to take care of you. I mean, that's a huge help. I don't think that system is existing in its full form nowadays.
No, and they seem to have the time to actually do that.
I mean, I think they took it as part of their duty or job profile to train juniors and junior anatomists. I don't think that exists very much today because of its squeezing time and pressure on the anatomy faculty.
But having said that, people talk about working hard now, and it's much more difficult than it was. Well, I do remember my first 2 years as being pretty tough. The head of department told me that if in the first 2 years I was going to give every lecture that the department gave and would teach the entire body, which I did. And he then said, if I had any spare time and wanted to do some research, he would make sure that he found me some money. I didn't have much time for that first 2 years.
Understandably.
And things were quite, health and safety didn't exist in quite the same way. So I've already mentioned that I had to dissect the part on the demonstration body prior to the session. I spent many evenings on my own in the dissecting room late into the night to be ready for the following morning, which you would not be allowed to do that lone working anymore.
Today. So days have changed.
Yeah.
But you had to go through that process.
Yes. And there were a number of occasions where it went so late at night that I didn't get to go home until the 9 o'clock lecture.
Okay, so you stayed, you
Yeah,
spent the nights in the reception hall, or
well, in an anatomy department in a medical school, there's always a facility to have a shower. There's the hospital canteen, if you could stomach a hospital breakfast,
yes.
etc.
So well, those were the days.
Yes.
Those. Well, it's interesting. Now, as an anatomist, I understood in your times, because these days again, with due respect, everyone is great, everyone is doing great work, but for me, an anatomist only becomes an anatomist, credible anatomist, when that person can teach whole body anatomy. Again, it's only my opinion. But in your times, that was the norm, isn't it? That you have to be able to teach whole body anatomy. You just cannot go and say, I teach this part. And
that just did not exist. That's why it took 2 years, because the undergraduate course was 2 years of anatomy. So I had to prosect and demonstrate all of that before.
So that means on your times, when medical graduates, they were doing anatomy for 2 years.
Yes.
I guess it has shrunk down to much lower levels of time nowadays, isn't it?
There are some places that do continue into 2 years. Where I am at the moment in Cambridge, head and neck is in the second year, but that's not taking up the full amount of time that the rest of the body took. So it's 1 term's worth of anatomy.
1 term. So basically, we're saying the entire first year and 1 term of the second year, roughly 1.5 years, roughly. So that is how the anatomy is being done in some British schools, medical schools.
Some finish in 1 year, but actually spend more time on it. It just depends on how the timetable is allocated. If you remember, in Imperial, when there was the graduate entry course, they spent the same amount of time as the 6-year course on anatomy, but they spent that time within 1 year.
Within 1 year.
Yeah.
Okay, I think, and I mean, now the question patterns in the exams have also changed. And I think more and more MCQ-based stuff is coming over. And at least the school the medical school I came out of in India, there were plenty of practical and vivas. And in fact, half of the exam was viva and practical exam, and half was theoretical. And in fact, in my times, where the system that I have come out as a doctor, the viva, the practicals, the oral exams, specimens, those were given higher weightage than actually theoretical exam. It was given much more importance, I would say. Nowadays, in many cases, I think the practical exams has almost evaporated, and that's possible.
I have to say, in my first lectureship, the viva was a mandatory part of the examination. Every student had a viva, and so even though there were only 100 students in a year, the viva still took 2 days for the staff to get through it. Then the idea came that they were not very accurate. Examiners could be biased. So then they became a way of giving students, if you like, a second chance if they were on a borderline.
Okay.
So you could have a viva. You didn't have to turn up, but if you didn't turn up, you'd already failed. And that could not bring you down further, but it could take you up. And then they disappeared. Now, disappeared for a number of reasons. In the my prehistory, second MB was the marks were not carried over. All you had to do was pass. So we were looking, had you met the standard, not to rank individuals within
the class,
unless it was for occasionally there may have been a prize for something specific, but that usually involved a separate viva for people who've done well in the written exam.
Okay.
So now a certain amount of marks are carried forwards. And so ranking has become important.
Yes.
And then when you get 350, 400 students in a year and you have less members of staff and they can't teach the whole body, you don't have the staff who can conduct the vivas.
It becomes not feasible anymore.
Absolutely not.
But has it done good to the students or the curriculum?
No, I don't think so. A very important reason that I'm saying that is that most postgraduate membership exams have oral OSCE type examinations.
And yes, and you have been, just to mention, you have been examining for Royal College of Surgeon students, isn't it?
Trainees. I mean, they're already working. So yes, I am a member of the executive of the Court of Examiners of the Royal College.
And you have taken, you have been examining for this MRCS exams for quite a few years.
Indeed, yes.
And you told me you have traveled to India and those overseas centers of exam for taking exam.
When I was young, all of the overseas candidates would come to the UK.
Yeah.
But that's an enormous cost on
candidates.
It costs a lot to run these examinations, but it is cheaper for the candidates to send some examiners out to the examination centres and pair those with local examiners and conduct the examinations locally.
Good.
But they have to be the same examinations that take place in London.
In the UK.
Yeah.
In the UK.
Exactly the same.
And you were talking of the OSCE. So don't you think an oral exam, because in at least what the system, again, that I have come out of, oral examination, communication, convincing the examiner was a big part of our assessments. And I don't come out of an MCQ system. I come out of still set type questions, which were not great always, but
I am sure that some candidates fail the exam the first time around simply because they have not been through the process. And they're not used to looking at somebody in the eye and answering the question and answering it quickly or saying, I don't know, please move on to the next question. Because there's, for an anatomy station, there is 9 minutes. And then then you have to go on. So the skill of doing the examination is part of the process.
And that process is often missing in the undergraduate degree.
I would say almost universally within the UK now. The MRCS exam is a 2-part exam. The first part is a single best answer exam.
Yeah, single best answer. Yeah.
And another problem of the way things have changed was in the 1970s. There were some medical schools where there was literally one exam at the end of 2 years, the whole body. Then that was thought to be too stressful. So they would take a limbs module, pass that, forget it.
Yes.
Move on to the thorax or whatever. But within MRCS, there are 70, 75 single best answer questions on anatomy the whole body at the same time. And I don't think there's any medical school in the UK or Ireland at the moment that expects students to put that knowledge together. But revising the whole body together is when it all comes together. I remember
Yes,
from my own experience. Yes.
of course, because you cannot separate, and that is I also have learned. And again, it's my observation. Maybe I'm wrong. That this modularization, where you chop out, you take thorax and abdomen, pelvis, and head, neck. This separation of different zones in human body or animal body per se, and the systems, because the systems work in unison, they work in synchrony, they just don't work in isolation of itself. So to understand the entire body design, probably
I remember
body approach is better, isn't it?
After studying the upper limb and learning to draw out the brachial plexus, as everybody does, but not knowing really what it was all about. And then, I don't know, 3 terms later, doing the neck again. That's where it comes from.
It happens for me because I used to coordinate abdomen pelvis module, and I used to teach pelvis, and lumbar plexus came in, and then I'm doing locomotion and lumbar plexus, of course. So it's a kind of a dilemma that shall I cover it, because that means we are overlapping modules. But human body, or I mean any vertebrate body design, is overlapping. We just cannot. These are artificial imaginary divisions in modularization. Do you actually think, because you have so much of experience for quite few decades over medical education in the UK mostly, especially, do you think anatomy as a subject can be modularized, or shall we just go for one module, whole body anatomy, which was stressful, but probably it was more rewarding and students carried out more information?
I think students do know more if they do it as one module. And the regular support for that idea comes from demonstrators who are studying for MRCS, but teaching in the dissecting room as part, either as a full-time university position for 1 year or as part of their clinical job. And they regularly say, I've learned so much more this year than I did as an undergraduate. Now, that's not true. They've put it together.
Yes. So they can understand the design more.
They've done it in 1 year.
They have that,
revised the whole body in 1 year.
And what actually I have seen, I mean, again, anatomy is a very different subject in the entire spectrum of medical subjects. And I personally think modularization does not work for anatomy. It's a whole body anatomy that ultimately pulls down, which actually makes the sense. It happens for my embryology lecture. So when I start giving lecture on development of urinary system, I mean, it's the urogenital system that develops. They're kind of overlaid on top of each other inseparably. But that's how anatomy builds up. It's probably different from other subjects like pathology, pharmacology, where probably you can build a bit more modularization. But anatomy as a whole body anatomy probably is better.
I think that's absolutely true. It's the old song, the knee bone's connected to everything. It's connected to everything else.
Yes. That's where anatomy is. Yes.
Functionally, your larynx is connected to the pelvic diaphragm.
Yes.
And you need to know a lot in between to be able to work out intra-abdominal pressures and voiding from either end, etc.
Yes, absolutely. So that is why again, maybe I might sound a bit old school, but I personally believe in whole body anatomy, because one thing I would like to see, again, maybe know from you, that these days I see anatomy, again, we can agree that probably the importance of anatomy has got diluted over the last 2 decades, probably. There are pressure these days on anatomists to even get grants, fundings, which is not very easy for an anatomist. I mean, How many times you have seen that you are winning a big grant from, I mean, from UK granting agencies, Wellcome Trust or something, or even for European levels? Do you think it's even fair, and that an anatomist has to, or is it an unfair pressure on anatomists that we are not biomedical scientists all the time, that we can develop this huge
I think you
projects?
find that a lot of anatomists, their research is very much biomedical. I mean,
Exactly.
a bit like for a BSc, there has to be a research element in it. And so for a student developing a project which is anatomically based and has enough research element in it is very difficult. They can't just do a better dissection than they did in year two and call it a
Yes.
PhD project.
Yes.
It is possible, but it's not easy to be able to do that. But the fact is that, if you have the anatomical background and you're working in neuroscience, as I did for a lot of my career, the number of times I was in meetings and somebody comes up with a new protein or they're talking about gene expression and you put your hand up in the meeting and say, and where's that expressed? And they say, in the brain. Well, it's not very helpful.
No.
You need to know a bit more about that.
Exactly. Exactly. But I have a fear that sometimes that's how it is going, that you give a kind of a more generic system. It's in the brain. And what scares me is that there are multiple publications now in British journals, including BMJ, that the level of anatomical information and knowledge the medical graduates are carrying from into their day one practice. And they have a list of day one competencies, but anatomical knowledge, what you are saying, it expresses in brain. How many medical graduates, and again, I'm not being critical, I'm just being realistic and with due respect. Do you expect, from your own experience, I think most of the time you will ask these days to a medical graduate, that is the answer you are going to get. It's expresses in a brain.
And going back to my time at St. Mary's, the students then had a brain between 2 and 5 2-hour dissection sessions to dissect that brain.
Go through each layers and thalamus, brainstem, and cerebellum, isn't it?
Yes. And when I left Imperial, they didn't do any of their own dissection, right?
Yeah, I saw you had some specimens and you basically stained it to show this part is hypothalamus, thalamus. But that in-depth knowledge.
But especially with the brain, because it doesn't move like a limb. So
yes,
having a 3D representation in your head of the pathways is something that not many people get easily.
Yes.
I would say the majority of students never get it. I don't know. I mean, it took me years.
It is very, very confusing.
I don't actually remember when it happened, but it sort of suddenly, well, not suddenly, over a long time, it was beginning to make sense, and I wasn't aware of the fact that I was actually getting it in my head, if you know what I mean. But,
I tell to my students that especially head neck anatomy is like Greek mythology. You read it first, you are completely lost, and you keep read it, and you have to keep on trying. And after probably 1 to 2 years, you start making a sense of the Trojan War, what actually happened. So it's pretty much it takes time to digest it.
And you need to know your Greek to know that pterygoid means wing.
Yes, exactly. So it takes time, but I don't know why, but there is no time anymore. I mean, I see my students, I mean, they are great people. They are trying the best, but they're finishing one lecture, they're running to another lecture, from there running another, and they have timetables which are very demanding sometimes. And this incredible different ways of assessments that has developed in modern medical curriculum, it's really cumbersome on the students. Some is asking MCQ, some is asking multiple choice, different types of questions, some is asking short answer questions, some is asking essay type questions, some is having midterm exams, some is having project. It's like incredible diversity of these assessment exams and different modules. I mean, was it like this in your times, or was there more kind of a uniformity?
To start with, there was not. It was essays or a practical exam.
Simple.
And a practical exam. And that was it.
I also came out of that kind of, I did not have, I think only 10 to 20% of my entire theoretical exam was MCQs. The rest was describe the development of this organ, or describe this, or essay type questions.
Like an essay on the anatomy of the stomach. Yes.
Anatomy of the stomach. And you start how it embryology and development and the musculature.
So you had to cover in that hour function of the stomach.
Yes.
Development of the stomach.
Yes.
Its gross anatomy and connections and its innovation, and finish up with some kind of clinical snippet like ulcers, which we thought in those days peptic ulcers were due to overactivity of the vagal nerve rather than being bacterial.
Helicobacter pylori, yes. Which got the Nobel Prize also.
Things move on. You need to know the basics, and some big mistakes have been made. When the beginning of the cutting down of the anatomy courses happened, don't have extraneous detail. So, we had whole bodies sliced, and you had to be able to identify things in that section.
Yes.
And too much detail. And it was only a few years before CTs were everywhere. And now everybody needs to know sexual anatomy.
Again.
Yeah, again, so we stopped teaching it just as it became used clinically.
Yes. Sometimes we are moving in circles.
And something that's happening now very much with head and neck is transoral approaches to the oral cavity, to the skull base, etc.
Getting into that cavities, yeah.
So, or even down into the back of the tongue, to the oropharynx, especially with tumors. The anatomy is the anatomy we've been teaching, but it's inside out.
Okay.
Start thinking of that, and you start dissecting from inside out, and you realize how close you are to the carotid sheath. You don't have the luxury of, wading your way through stuff to get there first. But that's, having robots, robots not doing the surgery, the surgeon is doing the surgery, but it's an extra small pair of hands which allows you to work in a small space. So you can do things inside out. And if you can do it that way, then the patient recovery time is going to be so much faster, etc. And no scars on the outside, etc. Yeah. So these things, it's all anatomy, but you have to know the detail and then apply it.
And for that, we need learned anatomists.
Yes.
Not piecemeal anatomists, like I know this part, I know that part. No, but whole body anatomy, probably with a strong grasp of anatomical knowledge, which probably is getting a bit more diluted. That's the worrying part. But the good news is probably that this minimally invasive surgical processes that you were mentioning, that will get in and have a quick shot, and that will kind of curtail the admission time for patients, and recovery time will be hastened.
But having said that, I mean, if I ever need a laparoscopic gallbladder removal, I would very much like the surgeon who does it to be able to do an open approach if it all goes wrong.
Yes. Yes, those are very important things. And I have participated in laparoscopic gallbladder cholecystectomy. And I think this 3D understanding, especially something when it is on your table, and we have our pincer grip, we are holding the scalpel and other things, something on that table. And laparoscopic surgery is basically you're changing the plane. So right now I'm visualizing on my table, but there I'm visualizing on a screen. So it becomes just 90-degree rotated, and I'm basically looking into it. And what I have also seen, it's not a criticism, it's known already that camera has its own distortions, especially in 3D. That's what we find when we have selfies. So the depth, where is the structure, is not always easy to understand in a screen because it's an artificial camera generated view. So that 3D depth can, at least I found it a bit more challenging. And because it is changing, because I'm seeing my visualization is here, and I'm working in different planes of visualization and the operation. So that synchrony took some time, and I believe it's more difficult.
But the brain can accommodate.
And the brain probably it's even more difficult.
Nobody can accommodate that. I mean, there are a number of times there have been attempts to bring 3D viewing to anatomy, into teaching. And I always find it very confusing because after years of doing anatomy in 2D, I'm actually seeing it in 3D. And then it is in 3D, but it looks strange.
Yes, it can look strange.
I can tell the depth because my brain has been doing it for such a long time. It's a bit like, I remember the old experiments in the 60s of the inverting lenses that eventually, because the image on the retina is upside down.
Yes.
So, but the brain sees it the right way up. But if you have inverting lenses,
yes, then it's
then after some months, the brain accommodates to that, and you see it the world the right way up again. But the problem then for the experimental individual is they take the glasses off and they have to go through the whole process again, another couple of months of the brain accommodating. And I guess the older you get, the longer it takes.
I can keep on talking to you forever, but we are almost in the last stage of our today's recording. You said that we have an upside down image created in retina and brain makes it correct. With so much of experience behind you, have you found any explanation how? Because it's one of the ever-standing mysteries, how brain does it. Do you have any speculation, any theory? Because it has fascinated me always.
It's just the ability of the brain, and I don't mean the visual cortex.
Yeah.
I mean the brain to interpret the world. You put your hand out, then everything is not upside down. Your feet are on the ground.
Yes.
So there's something about the way the brain works that is actually interpreting the real world and telling the brain, parts of the brain, what to do. The areas of the cortex that students learn about are the primary areas.
Yes.
Primary motor, primary sensory, vision, the other special senses. And these are a tiny fraction of the amount of cortex.
Very tiny, yeah.
And they ignore the rest of it. Because if you lesion it, you don't get a focal deficit because, it can't be doing anything. Well, no, it's doing something which is so complicated
that we don't understand.
We can't ask the questions about it. And lesions only have an effect on volume rather than a specific thing. These are the integrating areas of the brain, which must be the most complicated.
which is beyond our contemplation and comprehension.
Indeed.
And I think this is something I learned new about you, that you started your academic career as an anatomist on neuromorphology. And I have quite few subjects, topics that I will touch in our next episode. But for example, sleep. I have friends who suffer from a lot of sleep disturbances. It's a major topic nowadays, including because with its impact on mental health and many things. There are issues. I mean, brain mysteries are never ending. But probably for that, I have to go to second season, because there is so much to talk in the next episode. And in second season, we'll go into some more interesting topics. One last question before I say you bye for today. It has been said, I have read in papers, and I want to clarify with you because I believe what you say, that our human brain only uses a small fraction of it while we in our lifetime. Some say 7%, some says 10%, some says 14%. So a major part of the brain is just there, unused, unexploited. Is it true that a small percentage of brain is used and most of the brain goes unused? Is it true? I just wanted to.
It depends what you mean by unused.
I mean, the centers are there.
There's plenty of evidence that there are collateral alternative pathways.
Okay, and they are kind of dormant.
Dormant, but I think in rehabilitation medicine, it's quite clear that by stimulating these pathways, you can, for example, get a degree of recovery after stroke. More complicated than that, because stroke will kill off a certain amount of the brain.
Yes.
There'll be a penumbra around it, which is suffering from lack of function, but the neurons have not been killed. Sort of central neuropraxia, if you like.
Yeah.
And that may well recover. But on top of that is the utilization of other pathways. It does make sense to have built-in redundancy.
And do you think some of these collateral dormant pathways are those areas of the cortex which we don't understand and we think they are
almost certainly, yes.
Because
so there are areas that you can recruit. There are, for example, if we look at speech, for most people, I don't know, 95% of people, I don't know how this figure is arrived at, but we are left hemisphere dominant and right-handed. A few percent are the other way around. And some people, a smaller percentage, 1 or 2, may be bilateral. So the capability is there.
So you have ambidextrity. You can use both hands. Yeah.
It's difficult to work out exactly what's going on, because not so much now, but my mother was left-handed, for example, but was forced to write with her right hand. But she would always use scissors or sew or whatever, do other things with her left hand. So how do you determine these figures of the population at large?
It's very uncanny.
Who knows? But with modern neuroimaging, activity in different parts of the brain is measurable when certain tasks are going on. But I think throughout the body, whether it's your kidneys, there's overcapacity in the kidneys.
Yeah.
You can give one away as long as one is functioning perfectly.
Yes. And same for liver. I think liver can regrow, so it can recreate kind of its on some lost parts, isn't it?
And that's another thing that where anatomy teaching has changed. In the 70s and 80s, we just taught the gross anatomy of the visual lobes of the liver.
Yeah.
As soon as liver transplants became possible, a little more detail, had to know about the blood supply. And then when liver transplants became possible, the teaching had to change to the 8 functional segments inside the liver defined by their vascular trees.
So it seems the new type of technology arrives in our medical realm, including surgical wards, and that kinds of gives a feedback to the anatomy curriculum, and we change.
It must do.
It must do.
If you're teaching a subject within a defined time, which will never be enough, you have to decide what to teach.
What is the priority? So you have to prioritize.
What can be used in future careers, what you need to understand.
Fantastic. Professor Davies, this will continue. For today's episode, I think we have had enough. But in this next episode, I'll see you and we will continue with further journey. We'll get into the realms of One Health, our environment, how we are damaging it, or probably we are not doing great stuff to our environment. How to address it, or has it already reached an irreversible situation, or there can be something done. And I would like to also ask you in next episode some of your understanding and experience. Not everything can be proven, but what do you think? Like I have asked you about certain questions in this last parts of this segment about brain. So there will be some further questions. I would just like to ask you, what is your understanding or comprehension? Not everything can be proven, but what is at least your thesis? Because that will be great help for future generations and people like me to develop our further research ambitions. Thanks a lot for this. And I look forward to catch up with you in a equally exciting or probably even more exciting next episode. Thanks a lot. Bye.